Yeah, it's kind of interesting that this Easter weekend corresponds with the what's called Heije, which is the end of Kilche, which means the end of the rains or the winter retreat in the West. And it happens different every year because most Asian holidays are on the lunar calendar, while here in the United States we're on the solar calendar. Plus, in the West, we do Kilche at a different time so that it meshes up with our holiday season. And then in Asia, it coordinates with their holiday season and how they come and go. So, are there any questions this morning about anything? Anything's okay?
I have a question.
Okay.
It's kind of more of a maybe a more historical question, like more like Buddhist trivia type of question, I guess. Uh, where did is the are koans? Did they specifically come up when Zen specifically became a thing, or did the Buddha use koans in a certain way for his students, and did he come up with them?
Mhm. So, what we formerly called kong-ans is attributed to the sixth patriarch, who's around the 8th century. He dies in 712 or 713, I can't remember. So that's how it's formally thought of. But these kong-ans no doubt have a longer history. And of course, they're all based on what you would call the great question of life and death. What are you? So you're kind of the original kong-an is you. So it's interesting, maybe from an academic point of view, to think about all that stuff. But all that stuff just points to what are you? And that points to, well, what are you doing right now, ultimately, right? And so that's where this Kongan tradition comes. So definitely Buddha had this great question, what are we? What am I? Where do we go when we die? Where do we come from when we're born? All that kind of stuff is the original kind of Kongan. And then it becomes, at the time in the sixth patriarch, it starts to become a little more complicated, and then it becomes a kind of meditation technique. And most of the people here on the screen have experienced them in terms of actual Kongan interview with a teacher. And they exist in many different schools of Zen and in Buddhism generally. Although Zen style definitely emphasizes them more. Does that answer your question? Any other questions? Anyway, the big deal behind kong-ans is this great question of life and death. So the kong-an style teaching, although it takes many forms, it changes. It's different in the Tang Dynasty than it is in the Sung Dynasty. And Japanese style is different than Korean style, blah, 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 blah. But it all points back to this original great question of life and death. So that's kind of the basic kongan of our life, we might say, using that kind of language. But it all comes from the original great question of life and death, which is, what are you? So, any other kinds of questions? Please ask.
I have a question.
Sure, please.
Hello. What do you think Buddha would think about the teachings of Jesus?
Yeah, so it's interesting that today is Heije for these heart kilche people, and it's also Easter, right? So I don't know what Jesus would think, but I would. The way I always think about it, because I was raised a Christian, that they actually both point towards the same thing, relieving suffering. So Jesus came to take away the sins of the world. Buddha came to take away the suffering of the world. And there's actually just two different ways of talking about the same thing, right? Because the sinful nature of human beings is not so pleasurable, if you haven't noticed. And the same thing is true within Buddhism. All the bad stuff we do to each other creates this what we might casually call shitstorm that we call life. So how do you get out? How do you get out of that? How do you resolve that? What can you do about it? So the Buddha is concerned, and also Jesus is concerned about that. So Jesus gives his life, which means that's the main purpose of his life, and then he comes back to life. So that probably has a behind meaning too. I could speculate on it, but I'm not going to. And then the Buddha too, also, he truly comes to life after he gets enlightenment and he gets up from under the tree and goes to help people. So that's like a true life, is helping to take away the suffering of the world. So that's what I would say. I don't know what Jesus or Buddha would think about each other, but they definitely have the same direction in their life. How can I help the suffering of the world? Right. So that would be the same. And it's interesting because all of that basic theme gets framed in all kinds of religious contexts, but they're all talking about the same thing. And that's because this experience of suffering is so profound, so mind numbing, so painful. So Ting talked about before thinking and this experience is before thinking, right? When you think about death, or you think about getting hit by a car or something, it first originates from a before thinking experience, right? But then you start thinking about it, and of course you can't figure it out. So that's why the Buddha said, well, maybe we should start practicing. Of course, that's what he did. When he encountered old age, sickness, and death, well, God, I'm not going to be able to think my way out of this one, would be his ultimate reflection on that. So what does he do? He just so-called leaves and goes to find the answer to that. So one way to think about practicing is leaving, not that you're leaving home and moving to a cave in Tibet or something, but leaving in that you're letting go of your like and dislike mind and returning to your original self to answer that question. Because the answer, like Ting said, is not in your thinking, it's not in reading sutras, it's not in any of that stuff. The answer is found inside you, and it's based on direct experience. So all of our so-called meditation techniques or stuff are just kind of like ways of reflecting on that question. They aren't the answer to it, but they're ways of pointing you towards kind of shoving you out the door so you can encounter what you truly are, which is where the answer actually lies. So that's the way I would think about kong-ans, and that's probably you notice that when Jesus stood before the Roman authorities, he didn't say anything, right? Because there wasn't anything to say, would be my guess. So on that happy Easter note, are there any other questions?
I have a question.
Sure.
It's hard for me to frame, but when I think about the Heart Sutra, and particularly the Prajnaparamita mantra, it says the sort of greatest mantra, the utmost mantra.
Right.
Help me understand how or why that is. I mean, when I think about earlier verses that talk about dharma, I sort of get this feel of no one is sort of better or worse than another. It sort of
Right.
feels like it's very dual, and I'm trying to not think of it that way, but it, sort of explicitly says it.
Right. So anytime we have this saying in Zen, which I always like, open your mouth is already a mistake. So that's an interesting saying, because usually we're trying to learn something about Zen, reading books or something. But that isn't what Zen is about. So the way I think about it, I don't know if this is correct or not, but anytime you open your mouth and you're using words, inherent in words is this subject-object dichotomy. So you have a kind of dualism just as soon as you start talking, right? So this is the utmost mantra or whatever, all the things it says. Those are just advertising. So we always try to say something. We kind of give you a piece of candy or dress it up in some nice clothes or something to kind of encourage you to do it. So it's a kind of advertising. So Zen Master Sungsan said, well, you can even do Coca-Cola if you do it. You do it sincerely and you pursue it, because Coca-Cola will cut off your thinking and return you to your original self, your direct experience self, just as well as gate para samgate. And it doesn't even make any difference what language you use, right? So you're kind of trapped in this thing. If I'm going to talk about it, I'm going to use words. I could go, right, which Zen teachers do. And that is really easy to translate into German. You know what that is in German? Yeah. So this is really, doesn't have that, right? It doesn't have this and that. It only has one thing. So that's why, they'll drop a rock on your head, or you get hit with a stick. We don't do that much anymore. But all those kind of things are to just take you out of opposites and return you to oneness, right? And oneness is the answer to the great question of life and death. But even me saying that, that's already a mistake. Blah, 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 right? So after you've hung around Zen for a while, you get so bored reading Zen books that you probably won't do it anymore. And the reason, and if you do read Zen books, I would encourage you to read them for encouragement. You're not going to get any understanding of Zen from reading Zen books, that's for sure. So that's the Zen project. So the kong-ans does that, the bowing does that, the sitting does that, the chanting does that, the eating does that. Falling out of the back of a pickup truck will also do that for you. But I wouldn't suggest that particular technique. Any other questions?
Yeah, you said something about oneness.
Yeah.
Could you dispel all misconceptions that people might have?
No, I can't, but I will say something about it. Yeah, one, of course, I can't say the word one without implying the word two, right? So that's me just blah, 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 two, right? So that's why Zen will uses these kind of direct experience techniques. Like you'll notice the kong-ans, the more you think about it, the less you can answer it, right? So it's pointing towards some of what we call before thinking kind of answer. And even if it's a thinking answer, it should be a before thinking answer, right? So that's called becoming one. So if you want to understand Easter eggs, I suggest getting an Easter egg and taking some dye and coloring it, and then tomorrow you can peel it and eat it. Then you'll understand Easter eggs, right? And that's better than me explaining to you. I never quite got Easter eggs and what it had to do with Easter, but that's what they're called. So so it's the direct experience of it that is what it is. And then we can say all kinds of things about it, like, wait a minute, that's about a rabbit and an egg. Rabbits don't lay eggs, and what did that have to do with Jesus anyway? So, right, you can go on like that forever, but just eating an Easter egg will pretty well fill you in on that, what that's about. So that's about becoming one. So you become one through direct experience rather than thinking. Although the rub there is that thinking also is a kind of direct experience. So blah, blah, blah. That's before thinking, or non-attachment thinking. So non-attachment thinking means you perceive the behind meaning and you let go of whatever opposites dimensions there are to that kind of thinking. So that's all I know about opening my mouth about talking about becoming one. It just points to your original Buddha nature, experiencing the world moment to moment to moment to moment to moment. Nice idea. Any other questions?
This morning in the ceremony, Ting was talking about, we were talking about tight dharma and loose dharma.
Right.
And I'm having a thinking problem, I guess, in my mind is once I establish a practice, I'm really not clear what is really meant by tight dharma and loose dharma. I mean, do we enter into a routine every day of our practice, or if you can just briefly comment on what is really meant by tight dharma and loose dharma?
Right. So it refers to a practicing technique. So the Buddha left home and he practiced very hard, right? Or Bodhidharma is sitting in a cave on Sung Mountain for 9 years. Not a very, if you've ever been to that cave, you know that's not a very pleasant experience. And so the way I think of it about tight dharma is just a time when you bear down and try to get as many distractions as you can. Actually, it has to be a balance. If it's too tight, you know, like Zen Master Sung Sung eating dried pine needles for 100 days, that's not such a good idea. But that's definitely tight dharma, right? So, but it has to be done with wisdom and with balance. So we designate it's a kind of technique. We'll designate particular periods of time. Like you might designate 20 minutes every morning as your special tight dharma time, right? So you make it tight dharma by, okay, I'm going to do this every day. So you get, we call that tight, right? So you bear down. But if it's early in the morning and you have to pee halfway through that 20 minutes, you might loosen up a little bit and go up and go to the bathroom, right? Rather than whatever would happen if you didn't. so it's just it's a technique style pointing you towards your true self. So any kind of what's expedient about this kind of technique is that it pulls you out of your usual stuff. You know, so when you're pulled out of your usual stuff, you're kind of shocked, like, you know, like it's just before you hit the car in front of you, you'll have this enlightenment moment. And then after you hit the car in front of you, then you're thinking, oh God, did I pay my insurance? God, what's my mother going to say about what I just did to the front of her car? Blah, 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 right? But at just that moment, you have this direct experience. So tight dharma is to take you out of all of your comfort zone. You know, you're cruising down the freeway or whatever, and everything's comfortable and wonderful. It kind of does that to remind you, because what happens is people will get so engrossed in their like and dislike mind that they'll become attached to certain kinds of things. Now that attachment might be negative or it might be positive, but you get attached to it, right? So I only like Korean clothes. I don't like Chinese clothes, right? So practicing is a kind of, tight dharma is a kind of technique to kind of jerk you out of all of your familiar ways of thinking about things and patterns and everything, so you can focus on looking into yourself and answering this great question of life and death. But they're just techniques. So ultimately they aren't important, but they are used to kind of shock shock you into starting to pay attention. Because usually we're lulled away by, we might be lulled away positive because we like what's going on, or we might be lulled away negative because we don't like what's going on. But you need to kind of strike a balance between those ways in a way that kind of is shocking. So if you go to Kyolche for 90 days, or you do a 100-day solar retreat, or you practice for 20 minutes in the morning or 10 minutes in the morning, it kind of breaks your mind habit, so you can, which is a technique to allow you to start seeing what the hell is going on in your mind, right? And that's all. It's not special, although we say certain ones are special, right? But that's also just advertisement. It's a kind of technique too. But ultimately, it's all about looking inside and finding your true self, and then using that to help the world. So even coming here, even listening to this talk is a kind of technique. Don't attach to it. Particularly don't attach to anything that I said. So I want to thank you all for coming and listening and practicing today. And happy Hey Day. And now we'll have some announcements.